What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka NYPrepper. You're watching part 1 of the How to Survive a Nuclear War series. And in this series, I'm going to show you guys how to survive a nuclear war. And I'm going to show you guys some realistic things and practical things that you can do to protect yourself in the worst case event of a nuclear war with Russia or China or some other foreign superpower. And I don't think a lot of people talk about this, and I want to really focus on this topic because we just recently had a very close call in Ukraine. We were on the verge of nuclear war with Russia over Ukraine, and I had a lot of people sending me emails and writing comments asking me, how do you survive a nuclear attack and a nuclear war, and how do you build a fallout shelter? What do you do if there's a nuclear war? And so in this video series, I'm going to try to answer all your questions, and hopefully I can help you guys survive nuclear war if it ever were to happen, okay? And hopefully that day never comes, but it seems more and more likely, okay? It seems like nuclear war is basically inevitable at this point, but hopefully it never comes. And if it does come, this video series will help you to survive and make sure that you and your family are okay. So I'm going to show you guys some realistic and practical things that don't cost a lot of money that you can do to protect yourself. And I'm going to show you guys gear. I'm going to show you guys how to build improvised fallout shelters. I'm going to show you guys where you can take shelter if you don't have a fallout shelter in your basement or in your house, or you don't have access to a fallout shelter. I'm going to show you guys some ways that you can protect yourself from radiation, from overpressure, from the blast wave, and from thermal radiation. I'm going to go over everything you can imagine when it comes to protecting yourself from nuclear blasts and nuclear bombs, okay? So in this video, I'm just going to give you guys a very basic overview of nuclear weapons, and I'm going to go through some basic history of nuclear weapons to kind of prime you guys before I get into the more detailed aspects and the bread and butter, or the meat and potatoes of the series, which is, the type of gear that you're going to need, how to build a fallout shelter, where you can find fallout shelters near you, and things like that, okay? But this video, we're just going to give you guys a basic primer on nuclear weapons and understanding of how they work and the history behind them and some of the terminology, because it's very important to understand some basic concepts before you can get into the gear and the fallout shelters and things like that, okay? So you're going to have to bear with me for the first 2 to 3 videos in this series. I'm going to cover just basic concepts and stuff like that. It's going to be more of like a classroom, okay? Think of this as the prepper classroom, okay? And it may not be too exciting, but it's very, very important stuff. So without further delay, let's get started with part 1 of how to survive a nuclear war. The first thing we need to understand is that the only time that nuclear bombs have ever been used in the world was by the United States in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And to this day, those are the only 2 times that nuclear weapons have ever been used by humanity, okay? So that's one thing to remember, is that the United States is actually the one that has used nuclear weapons in combat. Russia hasn't used them in combat yet. China hasn't used them in combat yet. Only America has actually used nuclear weapons in combat, or actually it wasn't in combat, it was against civilian targets in Japan. But so I just wanted to mention that before I get further into the history of nuclear weapons. And there's 2 different types of nuclear weapons that you need to understand, and there's fission and fusion, okay? Those are 2 separate types of nuclear weapons. Fission is the splitting of atoms, and fusion is the fusing of atoms together, okay? When you split atoms apart via nuclear fission, there's a very powerful release of energy, and nuclear fission was the first type of nuclear weapon to be invented, and that was the atom bomb that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was a fission bomb that used the splitting of atoms, okay? Later on down the line, during the Cold War, something called nuclear fusion was created, and that was the opposite of fission, whereas in fission you get the energy by splitting the atoms, and in nuclear fusion you get the energy by fusing the atoms together, and when you fuse them together they become unstable and then they release energy, okay? So later on in the Cold War, they replaced fission bombs with fusion bombs, and the fusion bombs were on the order of magnitude of hundreds of or thousands of times more powerful than the fission bombs were, okay? The first nuclear weapon ever tested is very, very anemic compared to the type of nuclear weapons that we have today and the type of weapons that were used during the Cold War. The fusion bombs that were deployed during the Cold War were thousands and thousands of times more powerful than the atom bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we started out with fission weapons, and you can think of fission weapons as like the black powder guns or the musket guns, okay? And then when we invented fusion weapons, that was kind of like the modern sporting rifle, okay? In comparison to the advancement of technology, okay? So the fusion bombs, those are the ones that we use today, and the fusion bombs are many, many, many times more powerful than the fission bombs that were developed during World War II and used on Japan. So that's one thing we have to get out of the way. And so the first nuclear weapon to be developed started in 1939. Okay, that was the Manhattan Project. So let me just write that down for you guys. Fission. Fission is weak and old. It's an outdated technology. Nobody uses fission anymore. Fusion is what we use now, okay? Okay, those are the really powerful weapons. 1939 was when the Manhattan Project started, okay? Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project, if you guys don't know what that is, that was the code name for the secret government project to develop the first nuclear weapon in the history of mankind. Now, many people will argue that the Manhattan Project was not, in fact, the first weapon to be developed, the first nuclear weapon, but it was actually the Germans that developed the first nuclear weapon, but we didn't disclose that information to the rest of the world. But many people believe that the Germans, the Nazis, actually had already invented nuclear weapons before we did. It's just that all that information was kept secret after Hitler died and the Nazi Empire collapsed. The Western governments kept that a secret, but many people believe that the Germans beat us. But nonetheless, if you take what the textbooks tell you in school, the textbooks are going to tell you that America was the first country to develop the atom bomb, and it all started in 1939 with the Manhattan Project, okay? I'm going to read to you guys a little bit in detail about the Manhattan Project. So, in 1939, the U.S. needed a weapon to end the war. The Manhattan Project began modestly in 1939, but grew to employ more than 130,000 people and costed the U.S. nearly $2 billion at the time, and that's the equivalent of $23 billion today. Okay, so it costed $23 billion, the whole project, okay, in equivalent terms of today's money. And they employed 130,000 people. All right, that's absolutely insane, guys. That's like a giant mega bank. You know, think about like Chase Bank or one of these global banks. That's how many people they employ. So that's a massive amount of people working on this project. And specifically, the guy who was the head honcho of the whole project, his name was Robert Oppenheimer. All right, Robert Oppenheimer. A lot of you guys have probably heard of that name, Oppenheimer. So he was the head honcho. He was the brainiac. Okay, this was his project. Okay, he was the boss. He was a nuclear physicist. He was the director of Los Alamos National Labs, and he was the guy who actually designed the first bombs. Okay, the first atom bombs by the United States. So he was basically the inventor. Okay, he was the inventor. And most of the work on the Manhattan Project actually occurred in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Okay, that's where most of the work on developing the first nuclear weapons occurred, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Okay, and actually today, Oak Ridge, Tennessee is still a very secretive location where nuclear weapons are developed and different types of nuclear technology is experimented with. And for those of you guys that live in Tennessee, Oak Ridge is a major nuclear war target. So if you live anywhere near Oak Ridge, make sure that you have a plan, because this is a primary target for Russia and China in a nuclear war, because this is a very, very strategically important facility at Oak Ridge for nuclear weapons research and development. Okay, so most of the work was done in Oak Ridge by Robert Oppenheimer. Also, some other locations was the Hanford site in Washington State. And the Hanford site today is very, very toxic. And it's basically a ticking time bomb as far as an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. The Hanford site is where there's a lot of old nuclear waste that was disposed there during the Manhattan Project, and it's a ticking time bomb. So any of you guys that live near the Hanford site in southeastern Washington State, you may want to either relocate or make sure you have a bug-out plan, because if something were to ever happen at Hanford, it would be really bad, okay? And then also UC Berkeley was another location for the Manhattan Project, okay? All right, University of California, Berkeley. So the first people to discover nuclear fission, remember I talked about the fission reaction, which was the first type of nuclear energy that was invented by man, okay, was the fission energy, okay? The first scientists to discover nuclear fission were actually German in 1938, and that was Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, okay? So it was actually the German scientists who actually invented fission first, before we did. And so the Americans at the time were afraid that the Germans were going to beat us in the race to get the first atom bomb. So that's why the Manhattan Project was developed. We wanted to beat the Germans, and we wanted to end the war. We wanted to have a strategic advantage that would give us, leverage over the Germans, okay? So the Germans had their own atom bomb project, okay? And they were already in the process of researching the atom bomb. But most of the nuclear material that they used during the Manhattan Project was sourced from Colorado, the Northwest Territories in Canada, in Czechoslovakia, and in the Belgian Congo. Okay, that's where most of the uranium was mined. Okay, the uranium was taken out of Colorado, northern Canada, the Carpathian Mountains, and the Belgian Congo. All right. Now, Robert Oppenheimer is called the father of the atomic bomb, and the first atomic bomb in human history was tested on July 16th, 1945. Okay, so I'm going to write this down for you guys now. You can take a screenshot of this if you want, and we're going to move on to the next section here. Okay, we're going to talk more about the atom bombs themselves. Okay, so let's continue on here. So first atom bomb tested July 16, 1945. Okay, and this bomb was tested in a remote desert location in, let me write it down for you guys, Alamogordo, New Mexico. Okay, that's the first nuclear test. Okay, first successful nuclear test. This was the Trinity test. Okay, and the mushroom cloud was so high that it went up 40,000 feet in the air, which is taller than Mount Everest. Mount Everest is 29,000 feet. The mushroom cloud from the Trinity test was 40,000 feet, okay? 40,000 feet. That was the first bomb. That's how powerful it was. We're talking about the first bomb here. That's how insanely powerful these bombs were. All right? So it was conducted, the test was conducted at 5:30 a.m. on July 16th, 1945. It was 35 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico, on what was then the U.S. Air Force Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range, now part of White Sands Missile Range. Okay? And then shortly after the Trinity test, that's when we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th. Okay? August 6th and August 9th, 1945 was when we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima. Okay? I'm just going to clean this up a little bit for you guys. I know this is a little bit of like a classroom setting, but we're going to get more into the meat and potatoes of how to prepare for nuclear war and how to survive nuclear war. But first, in order to survive nuclear war, we have to have a background. Okay, so this is our background. So this was Hiroshima, August 6th, and then this one was Nagasaki. Okay? Hopefully you guys can see that, all right? So literally 1 month after the first nuclear bomb was ever tested in the Trinity test, 1 month later, not even 1 month, actually like 3 weeks later, we dropped 2 bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Together, both of these bombs killed between 130,000 to 230,000 people. Okay? All right, so 130 to 230,000 people dead from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Okay, these were the very first bombs ever created, and the only bombs ever used in actual combat or actually deployed. All right, that's a lot of people, guys. That's like the entire city of Buffalo, New York, dead. Okay, and most of those people were civilians. All right. So moving on from the fission bombs, these were the OG, if you will. All right, these were the original gangsters. Moving on from the fission bombs and World War II, we're going to move on to the fusion bombs, which were the super powerful bombs. All right, so let me just clear this board here, and we'll talk about the fusion bombs a little bit and the Cold War. All right, guys, so we have Ivy Mike, which was the first test of a thermonuclear weapon. And this test was done on November 1st, 1952. And this was a fusion bomb, okay? November 1st, 1952, okay? And this was a nuclear fusion bomb, and it was detonated by the United States on the island of Ilu Gelab in the Eniwetok Atoll, okay? And the U.S. would end up testing many, many weapons in the Bikini Atoll area in the Marshall Islands. That was a very popular testing area for fusion bombs, all right? So this is part of the Marshall Islands, all right? So Ivy Mike was the first fusion bomb, okay, ever tested, November 1st, 1952. And the fusion bombs, like I said, they get their energy by fusing the atoms together. And when you fuse the atoms together, it creates a lot of instability, and that releases a massive explosion, okay? Now, thermonuclear bombs is just another word for a fusion bomb, okay? So when you hear the word thermonuclear weapon, that's basically a fusion bomb, all right? Now, many fusion bombs are actually ignited, if you will, by fission bombs, okay? So the actual fusion bomb and the radioactive material for the fusion bomb is surrounded by a fission bomb. And the fission bomb is detonated first, and the fission bomb is what creates the compression that's needed to fuse the two materials together and fuse the atoms together in order to detonate the actual fission part of it, okay? So it's almost like a two-stage explosion, okay? It's kind of like a rifle bullet, okay? A rifle cartridge or a pistol cartridge. You have your primer, and then you have your gunpowder, okay? When the firing pin hits the primer ignites, it explodes. There's a little bit of explosive material inside of a cartridge primer, and when that primer goes off, it sets off the gunpowder, and the gunpowder sends the bullet out of the barrel, okay? So think about a fusion bomb as a rifle cartridge, okay? You have the nuclear fusion material at the core of the bomb, and on the outside of the fusion material, you have your fission bomb, okay? And the fission bomb triggers the fusion bomb to go off, because in order to fuse atoms together, you need tremendous amounts of energy to do that, okay? In order to compress atoms together, plutonium and uranium, you need massive amounts of pressure and heat and things like that, okay? And the only way to reach those levels of pressure and heat is to use a fission bomb, okay? So the fission bomb is the primer for the fusion bomb, okay? So I'm going to go through some popular nuclear bombs that were tested and used, and I'm going to list out some of their explosive power, okay? All right, guys. So I want to just share the units of explosivity that are used to determine how powerful a nuclear bomb is. So you have kilotons and megatons, okay? 1 kiloton is equal to 1,000 tons of TNT, okay? 1,000 tons. Think about how think how much TNT that is. TNT meaning dynamite, okay? 1,000 tons of dynamite is 1 kiloton. And then you have megatons. 1 megaton is equal to 1,000 kilotons, okay? So when the first fission bombs were invented, they were using the kilotons to determine how powerful they were, okay? Specifically, the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were around 20 kilotons, okay? So that's the equivalent of 20,000 tons of dynamite, okay? 20,000 tons of dynamite. That's how powerful the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions were. Think about how much explosion you get from just one stick of dynamite, okay? And then you have megatons, which were used when the fusion bombs came out. They were using megatons because kilotons were just too small of a unit to classify the power of the bombs. So then they came up with megatons, and 1 megaton is 1,000 kilotons, okay? So then you're looking at 1 megaton is 100,000, I'm sorry, not 100,000, is 1 million tons of dynamite. 1 megaton is 1 million tons of dynamite, okay? Think about that for a minute, 1 million tons. Just let that sink in, and that's just 1 megaton, all right? Now, the largest bomb that was ever tested in human history was the Tsar bomb, which was 50 megatons, okay? But these bombs are extremely powerful, guys. So I'm going to list the power of a lot of these common bombs that are well known throughout history so you guys can get an understanding of how powerful they were. All right, guys. So here's the most common nuclear bombs that you need to be familiar with and their explosive power. So you have the Trinity test, which was the first atom bomb, like I mentioned. This was the first atom bomb, first nuclear bomb ever tested, was 22 kilotons, okay? 22,000 tons of dynamite in terms of how powerful it was. So even the first bomb is enough to level an entire city, and that was just the first bomb, okay? Then we went to Ivy Mike, which was the first fusion bomb. That one was 10 megatons, okay? Then we had Hiroshima, was 18 kilotons. Nagasaki was 22 kilotons. And then we have Castle Bravo, which was 15 megatons. Castle Bravo was the most powerful fusion bomb that was ever detonated by the United States, and that was 15 megatons. And then we have the Tsar bomb, which was 50 megatons, okay? And the Tsar bomb is the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated in human history, okay? The Tsar bomb. And the Tsar bomb, if you guys want to take a guess what country that Tsar bomb was from, and it's Russia, okay? The Tsar bomb was detonated in northwestern Russia above the Arctic Circle. And the bomb was so powerful that it caused windows to shatter hundreds of miles away in Norway. About 500 miles away from where the bomb was detonated, people in Norway reported having windows in their homes getting busted by a pressure wave, okay, 500 miles away. That's like dropping a bomb on New York City and you being all the way in North Carolina getting your windows broken from that, okay? That's how powerful the Tsar bomb was, all right? And now there is rumors that Russia has even 100 megaton and 200 megaton warheads, okay, that they haven't actually tested but they built. And originally, when Russia was going to test the Tsar bomb, they actually had 100 megaton warhead that they wanted to actually test, but they realized that the test would have been too dangerous for the pilots that were dropping the bomb because the explosion was so powerful that the pilots who were flying the plane to drop the bomb would not have enough time to get away from the explosion. So they decided to do a 50 megaton instead, but they actually did have a 100 megaton bomb that they were planning to test, okay? But they scrapped it because they said it was just way too powerful, and you know, they didn't want to lose their men, and they didn't want to lose their bombers, okay? But the Tsar bomb was actually dropped off on from a bomber plane, okay? It was loaded onto a bomber plane, like a heavy bomber, and it was extremely heavy and massive, and they had to use a very heavy-duty bomber plane, and they flew it over to the Arctic Circle in northwestern Russia, and they dropped it, and the bomb was so powerful that the pilots could barely escape the shockwave. By the time the bomb hit the ground, and they barely made it out. They almost got killed, okay? So, all right, so that's a little bit of the history of the bombs and, you know, basic understanding of them. And now we're going to move on to the specifics of how a nuclear weapon actually works and the components of nuclear weapons. We're going to get more detailed with that. All right, guys, so now we're going to talk about the basic components of a nuclear missile. And the basic component of a nuclear weapon or a nuclear missile is you have your warhead, which is at the front of the missile, and then you have the actual missile itself, which propels the warhead to the target. So your missile is basically your rocket, okay? This is just a rocket, and the rocket, think about it like the boosters that the space planes use to get into space. It's all it is just a rocket, okay? It's a rocket that has a lot of highly powerful fuel inside of it, and the fuel can accelerate this missile to 20 times the speed of sound. And on the tip of the missile, you have your nuclear warhead, okay? The nuclear warhead is where the actual bomb is located, okay? So that's just a very basic sketch of what a nuclear weapon looks like. So the main types of nuclear weapons that we're going to have to deal with if there's a nuclear war is you're going to most likely be dealing with ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles. Okay, that's what ICBM stands for. ICBMs have a range of 3,000 miles or greater, roughly, okay? That's why it's called intercontinental, okay? This is the type of missile that Russia would launch to the United States, or the United States would launch to Russia. It's a missile that is able to traverse multiple continents, or from one continent to the other. So we're going to say about 3,000 miles or greater. Underneath the ICBMs, you have IRBMs, which are intermediate range ballistic missiles. And these have a range of between 500 miles and 3,000 miles, okay? So an intermediate range ballistic missile is still a pretty long range missile, but it's not designed to go across the ocean or across to another continent. It's designed to stay within the same continent, all right? Then you have SLBMs, which stand for Submarine Launched Ballistic Missile. And an SLBM is basically just an ICBM or an IRBM that's launched out of a submarine, okay? These submarines are very large. They're the largest submarines that have ever been created. In the United States, the submarines that launch SLBMs are called Ohio-class subs, okay? And we have about, officially the government says that we have about 20 Ohio-class subs. So we have a lot of Ohio-class subs, and we have the most submarine-launched ballistic missiles of any country in the world, okay? And we have the most submarines that are capable of launching SLBMs of any country. We have about 20 of them, and Russia has less than 5, okay? So we have 4 times the amount of submarines that are able to launch ICBMs than Russia does. Okay, we have about 20. Russia has less than 5. And each one of these Ohio-class subs can launch up to 20 ICBMs or 20 IRBMs. Okay, so that's a lot. So if you add that up, let's say you have 20 subs and each of them can, let's say, launch about 20 nuclear weapons. You're talking about 400 nuclear weapons that these subs can launch. Okay, that's very powerful. And we'll talk more about those in the next part in the series. In part 2, we'll talk about the submarines and how they function in a nuclear war, because it's very important. And then finally, we have SRBMs, which are short-range ballistic missiles. These typically have a range of less than 500 miles. And these are very popular in Russia and in Europe, in the Middle East. These are the types of missiles that you use when you have a target that's obviously close to you. And these were very heavily deployed in the Cold War in Europe, and Russia, specifically Russia, had a lot of SRBMs because they were right on the border with Europe. Okay, the Soviet Union went all the way to Berlin, so they had deployed a lot of SRBMs during the Cold War, which could reach targets in France and Britain and Spain and Western Europe. Okay, so SRBMs are not really that popular anymore, but in some areas of the world, there's still a problem, especially in Eastern Europe. There's a big threat from Russia with the SRBMs. They have a lot of Iskander ballistic missiles that they've deployed to the border of NATO, specifically in the Kaliningrad exclave in the Baltic area. And they've also deployed Iskander missiles in Belarus and Crimea. Okay, so SRBMs are another one, but these are not really a threat for us here in the United States. These are a threat if you live in Eastern Europe. This is a big problem for you. If you live in the Baltic countries, if you live in Scandinavia, if you live in Poland, Romania, Ukraine, any of the Eastern European countries, the former Soviet satellites, are within striking distance of Russian SRBMs, okay? But here in the U.S., we don't really have to worry about that. Now, we have to talk about the different types of fuel for a nuclear missile, okay? A nuclear weapon, you have, like I said, you have the rocket, and then you have the nuclear warhead. So the rocket has to be propelled by something, right? And I talked about how it has a very, very powerful fuel source that helps to propel it to the speed of 20 times the speed of sound. Okay, so in order to propel those nuclear weapons to 20 times the speed of sound and to get them to go over 3,000 miles, you need some pretty powerful fuel. And the two different types of fuel that they use is what's known as solid fuel or liquid fuel. Now, liquid fuel is an older technology. This was the first type of fuel for rockets back in World War II. When the Germans created the V2 rocket, they used liquid fuel. This is a very primitive technology, liquid-fueled rockets, okay? Pretty much all of modern ICBMs and IRBMs and SLBMs are solid-fueled, okay? Very rarely is liquid fuel used anymore. And the reason why is that liquid-fueled missiles, they have to be fueled up like a car right before they're deployed, okay? So, and the liquid fuel can go stale and get bad after a while. So you have to constantly rotate the fuel. You have to fuel it up before you want to launch, which takes time. And if we're talking about, let's say, a nuclear war where, you have to deploy a missile right away. If, let's say, Russia launches missiles at us and we have to launch back at them, we're not going to have time to, start fueling up our rockets because we have to launch our rockets right away. So that's the downside to liquid-fueled rockets, is that you have to fuel them up before they launch, okay? Now, some countries still use liquid-fueled nukes, okay? North Korea, in particular, uses a lot of liquid-fueled nukes, okay? And that's because North Korea has more primitive technology and they don't have enough money but they're starting to get solid fueled rockets. And there was the one rocket that they tested, I think it was in 2017 or 2018, where they shot the rocket up into the air like 2,000 miles, and then it went down and it landed in the Sea of Japan. That was most likely a solid fueled rocket, okay, or solid fueled missile. So the modern missiles of today use solid fuel because it doesn't go bad. You can fuel up the missile and let it sit there for decades and it'll still launch, okay? Versus liquid fuel, just like your car, okay? You can't just leave gas in the tank of your car for years and years. You have to rotate the gas, otherwise it's going to go bad, okay? So these are just some basic overviews of the different types of nuclear weapons. Solid fuel can pretty much stay forever. And then liquid fuel, you have to refuel it and rotate it, okay? And most of the modern nuclear arsenal is composed of ICBMs and IRBMs, okay? We don't really use SRBMs anymore, except Russia, maybe Pakistan, maybe Iran, maybe Israel, maybe North Korea, all right? But if we're talking about superpowers, most superpowers, they're more focused on ICBMs, IRBMs, and SLBMs, okay? Because these are the ones that give you a strategic advantage over other countries. If you have ICBMs, IRBMs, and SLBMs, that puts you on an upper level, okay? That puts you above everybody else, okay? And the bigger your arsenal is of these weapons, the more powerful you're going to be on the global stage, okay? So these are the weapons that we judge the nuclear powers by and how powerful a country's nuclear arsenal is, okay? We judge them by these, all right? So I just want to show you guys some more details of how a nuclear missile actually works. All right, guys, so here's our nuclear missile, our nuclear weapon that's heading for the United States, coming from Russia or China. Let's talk about how this actually works, okay? So here you have one country here, and here you have another country here, okay? Let's say this is Russia, or let's say this is Russia here, and this is USA, all right? Let's say Russia wants to launch a missile at the USA. The way that nuclear weapons work is that the weapon goes up into the air, okay? It goes up into the air, and it reaches what's known as an apex, all right? And when the missile reaches the apex, the warhead falls down towards its target, and the warhead has steering mechanisms to guide it towards its target, okay? So most of the rocket is expended by the time it gets to the apex. Once the missile reaches the apex, 90% of the rocket fuel has been burnt up, and there's only a little bit of fuel left, and that little bit of fuel is enough to steer the warhead down to the target, okay? So if we're looking at the missile here, okay, you can see that I have this missile drawn into different segments, okay? And this is a very important concept. So if this missile like this is launched from Russia, okay, you're going to have let's say 4 or 5 different segments. As the missile comes up, it's going to start to shed these segments, okay? Each one of these segments is loaded with rocket fuel, okay? And as the missile goes up to the apex, it burns up the rocket fuel from each one of these segments, okay? And by the time it reaches the apex, most of these segments are gone, and the only thing left is your warhead and maybe just a little bit of rocket fuel to steer the warhead down to the target, okay? Because once the warhead reaches the apex, most of the work has already been done, all right? When you're launching a missile, you're fighting gravity, okay? And this is where most of the energy is expended, is to get that missile up into the sky and get it up above your target. And once it's up above your target, then all you need to do is let that warhead go down to the earth and fall down, okay? And when it's falling down, you don't really need a lot of fuel, okay, because gravity is pushing it down, but you do still need a little bit of fuel to steer the warhead to the specific target that you want it to go to, all right? So if we're looking at this missile here, by the time, if this is the missile that's fired up into the sky, and we're trying to hit the US, okay? Most of these segments are going to be used up by the time we get to the apex. And then there may just be one segment left. So 3 of these segments will be expended by the time we get to the apex. And as the rocket is going up, it drops off each one of these segments as it reaches certain heights, okay? So they just fall off at certain points in the sky. Once it gets to a certain point, one of these segments will fall off. Once, let's say, all the fuel is consumed in this segment here, this segment comes off, and these 3 segments continue going, and then another one falls off, and then once it gets to the apex, there's just maybe one segment of fuel left, and that segment helps to steer the warhead down to the target. And the warhead is where the actual bomb is, okay? So that's a very important concept to understand. And when they fire these missiles, they fire them up high into the sky, okay? They don't fire them low, okay, like a cruise missile, all right? This would be, let's say, like a Tomahawk missile, flies very low to the ground. Nuclear weapons, they go very high up, they basically go into space, okay? They go outside of the atmosphere. They go out into space, and then once they get up into space, they can fly over the country that they want the bomb to land on, and then they can steer that warhead down to a specific target, okay? And the reason why the missiles are launched up so high in the air, there's a few reasons. Number one, it's very difficult to intercept a missile like this, okay? The reason why is that, let's say, for example, Russia and the United States were, let's say we're 5,000 miles apart, okay, between Russia and the U.S., okay? If Russia was to fire a missile like this, more of like a horizontal track, it would get there faster, okay, but we would be able to shoot it down. We would be able to intercept it easier, okay? But by firing the missile up into the atmosphere or outside of the atmosphere, it's almost impossible for us to intercept this missile because it's such a huge distance away that by the time our interceptors can reach this area here, this missile is already, way past the point of interception, okay? So this is done for a reason. It's done to eliminate the possibility of being intercepted. So Russia can literally launch a missile up into space, and they can stay at a safe distance away from the U.S. And then once the missile is in space, then it can cruise a little bit in space once it gets closer to the U.S., and then it can go back down and hit its target, okay? Now, there is some technology now called space-based missile interceptors, which are interceptor missiles that hang out on satellites in space, and the satellites have missiles that they can launch to intercept the ICBMs when they're up in space, but that's not a proven technology and we don't really know much about it yet, okay? So continuing on with how the nuclear weapons work, we're going to talk about the warheads now. So now we're going to cover a very important topic that you need to understand about nuclear war and warheads that a lot of people don't understand. And This is how the actual warheads work and the different types of warheads, okay? So originally, when nuclear weapons were first developed, like in World War II, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, the early Cold War weapons, the Castle Bravo, Ivy Mike, and the Tsar bomb, okay? These were all just really powerful single warheads, okay? And that's what you see here, okay? This missile represents a nuclear weapon that has one powerful warhead, okay? And that was the original, this is the old-fashioned original design, is to have a missile with one warhead on it, and that warhead hits one target, okay? But eventually, as time went on, human beings, naturally we want to make things better, and we're always thinking, and we realize that why should we only have one warhead on one missile when we could put 10 or 20 warheads on one missile? And this is a huge leap in terms of nuclear weapons, okay? It's just as big of a leap as going from fission to fusion. And so here we have what's known as the Mirv. The Mirv stands for Multiple Independent Reentry Vehicle, okay? And these are the types of nuclear weapons that most modern nuclear powers have, specifically the United States and Russia, okay? And Israel and possibly China as well. All right, Mirvs are the modern nuclear weapon, okay? These types of singular giant warheads are no longer used, and there's a lot of reasons why, okay? And I'm going to explain to that. I'm going to explain to you guys that the reasons why. So when you have a one missile with one warhead, even if it's a really powerful warhead, the problem is it's much easier to intercept, okay? When you have one missile with one warhead, all it takes is one interceptor missile to intercept this missile, and it's out of the fight. It's gone, okay? So that's a problem, because if, let's say, you have 500 missiles and the enemy has 500 interceptor missiles, it's pretty easy for them to shoot these missiles out, okay? And if these get taken out, you're screwed, okay? But with the Mirvs, you have up to 15 or 20 warheads on one missile, okay? And each one of these warheads can target different targets, okay? So military planners and generals, they realized at some point later on in the Cold War that they didn't need to have these gigantic nuclear bombs. They actually realized that they only needed very, very smaller bombs, like the size of the Hiroshima bombs, or even smaller than the Hiroshima bombs. Okay, they didn't need these massive, 50 megaton bombs that were going to just totally obliterate everything within 100 miles. They realized that they didn't need that, okay? What they needed was nuclear warheads that were smaller, that could target specific targets that were very important to the enemy country, okay? So let me give you an example, okay? Think about strategic military bases, very important, let's say relocation bunkers for the presidents and VIPs of an enemy country, very important military bases, any kind of very strategic targets. You don't need to have a huge explosion to take those targets out. And so military planners realized that they would rather have a lot of smaller warheads that they could use to target, let's say, hundreds of military bases of, let's say, the United States or Russia. Let's say if Russia wanted to take out the U.S., the Russian generals realized that it's more productive to have, let's say, 10,000 small nukes than it is to have 100 big nukes, because with those 10,000 small nukes, they could target military bases and critical infrastructure and cities and dams and they can basically bring an entire country to its knees without having to obliterate, you know, the entire civilian population. They can just strategically and surgically drop nukes on military bases and decapitate the entire military of the enemy country by doing that, okay? So they realized that having Mirvs was a better idea, okay? And so what they did was they put multiple warheads onto one missile. So what this does is it also makes it harder to intercept, okay? Because now you have one missile that has 10 different warheads. So thinking back to my previous drawing of the apex, when this missile reaches the apex, it opens up at the top here and it deploys all these warheads, and each one of these warheads goes to different targets. Okay, so you don't need as many missiles to hit a lot of targets. You could have 100 missiles, and with 100 missiles you can hit 1,000 targets if each one of your missiles has 10 warheads on it, okay? So this is the new technology, Mirvs, multiple independent reentry vehicles. And when you have that many little warheads, they're harder to intercept, okay? Because thinking back to the giant Tsar bombs and the Castle Bravos, if let's say you only have 100 nukes and you launch those warheads, if you only have 100 of them, it's easier to intercept because there's not that many of them. But if you have Mirvs, where you have a lot of smaller nukes and each missile has 10 or 20 smaller nukes, if you do the math, you know, if there's let's say you launch 100 missiles and each one of those missiles has 20 warheads, that's 2,000 warheads that need to be intercepted. And that's basically impossible. No matter how good your technology is, it's impossible to intercept that many amount of warheads, okay? And on top of that, each one of these smaller warheads can have countermeasures to fool any kind of interceptors, okay? So you have one missile with, let's say, 10 warheads, and each one of those warheads is going to different targets, and each one of those warheads has decoys like chaff and hot air balloons, okay, mylar balloons. And what these do are to fool the interceptors that are trying to take out these warheads. They deploy a mylar balloon that's inflated with hot air, and that creates a heat signature. And the heat signature from that mylar balloon is going to create another target for the interceptor, because the interceptor doesn't know if the hot air balloon is a real nuke or if it's not, okay? So, you know, you have 10 warheads, and each one of the warheads has a hot air balloon with it, and chaff. Chaff is for radar, okay? It fools the radar and stuff. But let's say each one of these warheads has a mylar balloon in it. Now you have double the amount of targets for the nuclear for the interceptors, okay? Because before you had, let's say, 10 warheads that needed to be shot down before they land and hit their targets. When you introduce hot air balloons, now you may have 20 or 30 targets, okay? So the hot air balloons, the mylar balloons create extra heat signatures for the interceptors, and the interceptor has to shoot down all of the heat signatures because they don't know which one is a real warhead and which one is a balloon. Okay, so that's why the Mirvs are such a powerful technology. All right, guys, so now I want to talk about how many nuclear weapons all the superpowers of the world have. And contrary to popular opinion, actually Russia is the #1 threat for a nuclear war. And the reason why is if you look at these numbers, you can see that China only has 350 nuclear weapons, and Russia has the most nuclear weapons in the entire world. And this information comes from the Federation of American Scientists, and I believe this was from 2019 or 2020, but they update this tally every year. And obviously, the Federation of American Scientists, they don't have all the information. They're just taking their best guesses, okay? But based on the Federation of American Scientists, it's actually Russia that has the most nuclear weapons in the entire world, okay? Right behind Russia, you have the US, and then you have China. But look at the difference between China and the US and Russia. China only has 350 nuclear weapons, and Russia and the US have over 6,000 or 5,000, okay? So Russia has 6,257 nuclear weapons, and 1,600 of them are deployed. So what that means is that out of the 6,250 weapons that they have, 1,600 of those are ready to be launched at a moment's notice. The U.S., right behind Russia, has 5,550 nuclear weapons, and we have 1,000 deployed, okay? So we have 1,000 nukes ready to go at a moment's notice. They're ready to be launched. China has only 350 nuclear weapons, and that's the reason why Russia and China are becoming really close allies now, okay? Because China realizes that they need Russia for their protection, okay? Because China doesn't have enough nuclear weapons to protect itself from the United States. So China needs Russia for their nuclear weapons, and Russia needs China for their economy, okay? Because Russia has economic problems, and they've always had like a, not the best economy, okay? Russia has always struggled economically, especially since the Cold War, okay? So Russia needs China for the commerce, and they do a lot of business with China. They sell a lot of resources to China because China has a lot of people. They have the most people in the world, and China doesn't have a lot of natural resources because it's a small country, and it's mostly barren desert in the western side of China. So China needs Russia for their resources, and Russia needs China for the commerce and economy. And China needs Russia for the nuclear weapons, okay? So only 350 from China. So what that means is that if there ever was to be a nuclear war, the biggest threat is Russia, okay? It's pretty much the same thing as the Cold War. You know, we're taught in school that the Cold War ended, but it really never ended, okay? We're still in a Cold War right now, okay, with Russia, all right? Russia and the U.S. have the most nuclear weapons, and if there's ever going to be a nuclear war, it's going to be between Russia and the United States, okay? China's not going to have enough nuclear weapons to really do anything to us, all right? Behind China, you have France with 290 nukes. UK has 195 nukes, and the UK is actually a big customer of the United States, and the UK gets most of their nukes from us. They specifically, the UK has a lot of Trident missiles, and Trident missiles are the submarine-launched ballistic missiles that I talked about earlier. All right, they have a lot of Trident missiles, and they have a lot of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and they have a lot of submarines that can launch the Tridents, okay, which are SLBMs. Okay, so that's most of the UK's arsenal is SLBMs, Trident missiles. India, 160 nukes. Israel has 90, and the DPRK, which is North Korea, has 40, okay? Now, some of these numbers could be a little bit off. You could also throw Pakistan in there, and, Pakistan could also have maybe 100 nukes or so. It's possible that Israel has more than 90. It's possible that North Korea has more than 40. But more or less, this is going to be fairly accurate. All right, we're looking at just a general amount here, and you can see that Russia and the U.S. are way above the rest of the world, okay? Way above. So if there's ever to be a nuclear war, it's going to be between Russia and the United States. So now we're going to discuss a very critical concept in nuclear war, and that's what's known as the nuclear triad, okay? This is a very, very important concept that you guys need to understand. And the nuclear triad is basically just a fancy term for nuclear weapons that can be deployed from land, sea, and air, okay? So when a country has a nuclear triad, that means that they can deploy nuclear weapons from land, from sea, and from the air, okay? And so far, the only true nuclear triad country is the United States, okay? The United States is the only country in the world that has a true nuclear triad. And the reason why the nuclear triad is so important is if there's ever a nuclear war, okay, it's good to have a variety of ways to deploy the nuclear weapons, okay? Because let's say, for example, if Russia were to launch nukes at our land-based nuclear weapons and destroy them and take out our land-based nukes, we still have nukes in the ocean and we have nukes that we can drop from the sky. So it would be very difficult for Russia to eliminate all of our nukes because they would have to target our land-based nukes, they would have to target our submarines, which we have 20 of them, and those submarines are nuclear powered, so they can stay underwater indefinitely. They could be anywhere in the world, and we could launch those nukes from anywhere, any ocean in the world. And so we're going to have the sea as a backup and the air as a backup as well, okay? In case Russia were to take out our land-based nukes, we have our Ohio-class subs and Trident missiles, and then we have our B-2 stealth bombers here, which are going to drop the bombs from the sky, okay? So the nuclear triad ensures survivability in a nuclear war. It ensures the survivability of our nuclear arsenal, so this way the enemy can't destroy our entire nuclear arsenal in one giant strike, okay? Because if all we had were land-based nukes, all right, let's say we didn't have our Ohio-class subs, let's say we didn't have our B-2 bombers, okay? Let's say all we had was land-based nukes. Everything we had was in a silo, okay? Let's say they were all in silos, okay? All of our nukes were in silos, okay? If Russia has satellites, Russia has intelligence planes, just like we do, okay? If all we had were land-based silos, they could just target those silos with nuclear weapons as their initial strike, okay? Russia would already know where our silos are through satellites, through reconnaissance planes. They already know where 70% of our silos are, okay? So if all we had were the silos in the beginning of the nuclear war, Russia would just have to target those silos and take them out. And once they take out our silos, we have nothing, okay? It's kind of like if you get into a fight with a boxer and the boxer only knows how to use his fists and he can't kick, he can't wrestle, he can't grapple, he doesn't know anything else but how to punch. If you grab that boxer's arms and you dislocate his shoulders or break his arm, he's useless, okay? And that's basically what the nuclear triad prevents, okay? It prevents our entire nuclear arsenal from being wiped out in one giant strike, okay? So if we go back to the boxer example, okay, I'm going to just make this very easy to understand for you guys. So let's say you're not only a boxer now, but you can kickbox, you can throw some kicks, and you can wrestle, okay? Now, if somebody grabs your arm and breaks your arms and your arms don't work anymore, you can still throw a kick. You can still try to take somebody down and choke them out. all right? But if all you know how to do is box, if your arms are taken out of the fight, you're useless, okay, because you don't know anything else. So a nuclear triad, you have land, sea, and air. And the U.S. is the only country that has a full nuclear triad, okay? And a critical component to the nuclear triad is having stealth bombers. And that's what sets us apart from Russia, okay, is that we have very advanced stealth bombers, all right? And the stealth bombers give us a true air delivery system where we can drop a nuke anywhere in the world and not be detected by enemy defenses, air defenses, and anti-aircraft systems. So the stealth bomber is a critical component of the nuclear triad, and that's what Russia lacks and that we have a lot of. We have a lot of stealth bombers, and we also have a lot of Ohio-class subs, okay? And Russia doesn't have them, okay? Russia, like I said, only has a few subs that they can launch SLBMs from, and they don't have any stealth bombers yet that we know about, but they do have regular bombers that are not stealthy that they can launch weapons from or drop bombs from. But those bombers do not give a true air capability because we can easily shoot those bombers out of the sky, okay? But with our stealth bombers allow us to penetrate enemy airspace that's heavily guarded with anti-aircraft systems, and we can drop those bombs deep into the deep behind enemy lines, okay? And that's not something that a regular bomber can achieve because the regular bomber would be immediately shot down. So the U.S. is the only true nuclear triad country, but Russia is also not far behind us, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Russia's capabilities now. They're a little bit different, and the reason why they're different is because of the geography of Russia and the U.S. We have different terrain, and so we adapted to our terrain differently than Russia did, and that's why Russia has different delivery systems than we have, okay? And their nuclear triad is not the same as ours. They don't have the same capabilities as ours because their terrain is different, their location is different. For example, the United States, we're surrounded by many, many oceans, and we have water all around us. We have the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean on both sides of us, and we also have the Arctic Ocean on top. Okay, so we're surrounded by water, and because we're surrounded by water, we developed a very strong sea-based delivery system with our Ohio-class subs because we realized that we have all this water around us. That's another reason why we have such a well-developed Navy, because we have so much water around us. We're surrounded by water, basically. So we need to have a sea-based delivery system, and we need to have a good Navy because we're surrounded by water. Same thing with the air, okay? We're far away from any enemies, so we have to be able to deliver bombs by air. Russia's a little different. Russia doesn't have as much water around them. They have, on one side, they have Europe, and then on the other side, they have the Pacific, and then to the south, they have Asia, okay? They have China, they have Afghanistan, and all the Stan countries, you know, all those Middle Eastern countries. So they have more land-based systems than we do because they have more land, okay? If you think about it that way, they're a very large country. They have a lot of dense forest cover, and they use that forest cover to their advantage to hide their silos, okay? Meanwhile, we can't hide our silos as much because most of America, especially the western two-thirds of America, once you get across the Mississippi River, is pretty much wide open country with scrubland, okay, and plains. And so it's hard for us to conceal our land-based systems. So as a result, we had to lean more into the sea and the air because of our terrain, because we have more open prairies and open terrain, especially in the middle and western part of the U.S., okay? Versus Russia, Russia is all land. They only have ocean on one side and on the north is always frozen, so that doesn't even really count. All right, but they're surrounded mostly by land, and they have very dense forest cover. All right, all of Russia is a giant forest. They don't have any prairies. They don't have any plains. Maybe some parts of southern Russia, close to Kazakhstan and close to Mongolia, may have some open terrain and prairies and steppes. Okay, there are some areas in Siberia that have like those steppe environments, but most of Russia is very heavily forested, and because of all that forest cover, they were able to develop a significant portion of their nuclear arsenal as land-based systems, because they can conceal their land-based systems inside of those forests. Okay, so I'm going to go into more detail of the different nuclear arsenals of the US and Russia, because those are the two heavy hitters in the world. We're not going to talk about China or the other countries because they're not a real threat, but we're going to break down the nuclear arsenals of the US and Russia now, and keep in mind the nuclear triad while we're doing this. So, all right, guys, so keeping in mind the nuclear triad, we're going to go over the USA's capabilities and what our nuclear arsenal is composed of. So we have the land, we have the sea, and we have the air. We have a true nuclear triad. So our land-based missiles are mostly located in Minot, North Dakota, in southeastern Wyoming, and around the Great Falls area of Montana. Okay, so these three states here, North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, have all of our land-based nuclear weapons. Okay, and so if you live in any of these states or surrounding areas, these are a major nuclear target in a nuclear war. Okay, because going back to the boxer example, if Russia wants to eliminate our nuclear arsenal, so this way we can't strike back at them, they're going to go after our land-based missiles in North Dakota, in Minot, in Wyoming, in southeastern Wyoming, and in Warren Air Force Base, in Minot Air Force Base, and in Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Those are the three bases, okay? Minot, Warren, and Malmstrom, that's where all of our land-based nuclear weapons are, okay? Those three areas and the surrounding vicinities have all of our silos, and Russia knows where most of them are. So if there was a nuclear war, they would target these areas, okay, to wipe out our ability to strike them. And the missiles that we use, our land-based missiles, are known as the Minuteman ICBMs, and these are the newest weapons that we have. The older ones were the Peacekeeper missiles, and the Peacekeeper missiles were in the 80s. They were phased out in the mid-80s, and they were phased out, and then the Minuteman missiles took over. And again, these missiles can travel 20 times the speed of sound. Okay, they're very, very fast, and they're basically impossible to intercept with an interceptor. Now, moving on from land-based, our sea-based capability, which is very robust. We have Ohio-class subs, which are the largest submarines in the entire U.S. Navy. Okay, the Ohio-class subs have nuclear reactors on board, and they can stay in the ocean for 20 years without any kind of maintenance or any kind of refueling. Okay, they can stay in the ocean for 20 years. Okay, so they have a 20-year service life, and we have about 20 of the Ohio-class subs. Okay, now each of our Ohio-class subs can fire up to 20 Trident missiles. Okay, and the Trident missiles are similar to the Minuteman ICBMs. They're basically the same thing. They have a little bit shorter range, and they can only carry a smaller payload than the Minuteman ICBMs. The Minuteman ICBMs are larger, and they have more fuel, obviously because they're land-based, so they can really make them very massive. but the Trident missiles are still nothing to sneeze at. The Trident missiles can deploy Mirv weapons easily. They can deploy up to 10, 15 warheads per missile, and they can fire up to 20 Trident missiles, okay? They have a bay on the top of the submarine. When the submarine wants to launch the missiles, it comes up from the bottom of the ocean, and it opens up a bay, like a door, and out of the door, they have tubes, and the tubes launch the missile up into the air, and then they can hit their target, okay? They can even launch the missiles from underwater. They don't even have to surface, okay? So this is a very powerful capability that we have, and we have 20 of these, okay? And they're constantly circling the ocean. They could be anywhere. They could be in the Arctic Ocean. They could be in the Baltic Sea. They could be in the Mediterranean. They could be in the Black Sea. They could be anywhere, okay? And that gives us a very powerful ability to counterattack if Russia were to try to take out our land-based systems. We still have all of these subs in the water, and each one of these subs can fire 20 Trident missiles, about 20, and each one of those missiles can have 10 or 15 warheads in each one. So each submarine can launch up to 200 warheads from each one, okay? Because you have 20 missiles, and each missile has, let's say, 10 warheads on it. That's 200 warheads per sub. And then we have 20 subs, so that gives us about 400 warheads that we can launch just from submarines, okay? That's huge. Moving on to the last category is the air, our airbase component. Oh, before I get into the airbase, I forgot to mention, you have the two main bases where the Ohio-class subs and the Trident missiles are stored is Kings Bay, Georgia, and Bangor, Washington. Okay, Bangor, Washington is right outside of Seattle. It's in the Puget Sound area by the Olympic Peninsula. So Kings Bay, Georgia, and Bangor, Washington are massive nuclear targets. And in a nuclear war, Russia would likely target these areas in addition to North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. So if you live anywhere in Georgia or coastal Washington, you better make sure you have a bug out plan and a fallout shelter, all right, because these areas are going to get bombarded. Bangor, Washington stores thousands of Trident missiles, and Kings Bay, Georgia has a lot of our Ohio-class subs. Okay, so these are big targets. Then finally, we have the air component, and the air component, like I mentioned, is the B-2 bombers, the B-2 stealth bombers, and the stealth bombers are the best in the world so far. Now, we know that Russia and China are working on their own stealth bombers, so within the next few years, they are probably going to have their own, unless they have some kind of an economic collapse. But they're working on stealth bombers, but we have a lot of stealth bombers, okay? We have a few dozen of them, and our stealth bombers allow us to penetrate behind enemy lines undetected and drop nuclear weapons on our enemy, okay? So the problem with the B-2 bombers, though, is that you need a runway for them to take off from. So these B-2 bombers have to be stored somewhere, and a lot of them are in Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, but they're all over the country. They move them around constantly because they can't afford to leave them in one area, because if they leave them in one area, Russia could just target that one area and they could wipe out all of our B-2 bombers. So they constantly move the B-2s around, but the Whiteman Air Force Base is a huge target because that's where a lot of the B-2 bombers are stored. You also have B-1 Lancers and B-52 Stratofortresses, which are also used for nuclear bombing. But the problem with the B-1s and the B-52s is that they're not stealthy. Okay, the B-1 Lancer was the original nuclear bomber. Okay, but the problem with the B-1 Lancer is it doesn't have full stealth capability like the B-2. Okay, the B-1 Lancer has a reduced radar signature, but it's not fully stealthy, so it's partially stealthy. The B-52 is not stealthy at all. It's just a giant plane, okay? But the B-2s is really the most critical component of our air-based leg of the triad. And then the B-1 Lancer is also important. The B-1 Lancer is a backup to the B-2, and the B-52 is a backup to the Lancer and the B-2. And the B-1 Lancers are based out of Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, and that's another major nuclear target, okay? So now I'm going to show you guys what Russia's arsenal looks like and how theirs differs from ours, okay? Now remember what I said, because the United States is surrounded by oceans, and we're more of a ocean country in the sense that we have a lot of water around us, we really developed our Navy, and with that we developed our sea-based nuclear arsenal and our air-based nuclear arsenal. But Russia developed their land-based capabilities because of the dense forested terrain that they have, and because they have such a large land mass. That massive amount of land that they have makes it difficult for us to target individual silos, okay? So I'm going to show you guys Russia's nuclear arsenal now. And finally, we're going to talk about the Russian arsenal, and this is going to finish up the video. This is going to finish up part 1 of how to survive a nuclear war. And in part 2, I'm going to discuss specifically how a nuclear war would play out and get more detailed into the specifics of a nuclear war and what to expect. But here we're going to talk about the Russian system here and what their arsenal looks like. So Russia does not have an air-based leg of the triad, okay? They don't have any stealth bombers that they can use, but what they lack in air power, they make up for with their land-based capabilities and some of their sea-based capabilities, but really they stand out in their land-based capabilities. So if you look at this board here, you can see I have land, hybrid, sea, and air, okay? And I'll talk about the hybrid one in a second, because this one is pretty interesting. But the land-based component to Russia's nuclear arsenal is significant. They have a lot of missile silos scattered throughout Siberia, and they use the forest cover of Siberia to hide their missiles, okay? And again, that's not something that we have, because all of our 2/3 of the United States is open country, okay, with the exception of the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachians and the East. Most of the United States is open country, so it's easy for our enemies to see where our missiles are located. But Russia, on the other hand, is absolutely massive. If you look at a map of Russia, Russia is a huge country. It's the biggest country in the world. From one side of Russia to the other, you're talking about thousands of miles. You could literally fit 3 of the United States into Russia. So Russia is 3 times the size of the United States. And because the land mass that they have is so big, they don't really need an air-based component as much as we do. And they don't really need a sea-based component as much as we do, because they can use that huge landmass that they have to their advantage, and they can scatter the silos all over that huge area, and they can hide those silos underneath the dense canopy of the taiga forests, and it's going to be hard for us to pinpoint where their silos are, okay? So that's what they rely on. They rely on the Siberian forests and the huge landmass that they have to conceal their silos, okay? And that's a significant threat to us, okay? Because we don't really know how many silos they have. You know, we may have pinpointed a good amount of them through satellites and through reconnaissance planes, but there could be a significant amount of silos that we don't know about that they would use in a war, okay? So their land-based missile system is significant, and that's where most of their arsenal is located. Now, another interesting thing about Russia is what I call the hybrid leg of a nuclear triad. And when I say hybrid, what I mean is that they have what's called a TEL. A TEL stands for Transporter Erector Launcher. And a Transporter Erector Launcher is like a giant truck, and the truck has a big missile on it, and they can drive this truck anywhere they want, and they can park it, and then they can lift up the missile and launch the missile up into the air. A lot of you guys may have seen those on the North Korean parades. When North Korea does their parades, they always show off those big missiles that are loaded on top of a truck. That's what's known as a TEL, a Transporter Erector Launcher. So it's a huge truck, and the truck holds one big missile on it, and the truck can drive anywhere. It can drive on muddy roads. It has high traction tires, and it can drive anywhere, and it can park itself, and once it parks itself, it lifts up the missile into a vertical position, and then it can launch the missile anywhere in the world, okay? So the Russians have a lot of the TELs, okay? They don't have as many subs as we do, okay? But they have a lot of TELs, and the TELs are kind of like a hybrid between land and sea, because they kind of act like an Ohio class sub, or they kind of act like a submarine launched ballistic missile, because they can move these missiles anywhere inside of Russia, and we're not going to know where they are because they're very small. You know, if you're looking at an area the size of Russia, you have 5,000 miles of nothing but forest. And you're not going to know where these trucks are. You don't know where they're going to be. And even if you find out where they are, they can just move them around, and they can hide them. They can leave these TELs concealed under the dense Siberian forest. The Siberian forest is very dense. They have that thick taiga forest, and they can hide these TELs under the forest canopy, and our satellites are not going to be able to see what's underneath the trees, okay? But they can leave these TELs scattered throughout Russia, and they can just move them around anywhere within Russia. They can drive them all over the place, and this kind of gives them a almost like a submarine type capability. They function kind of like our Ohio class subs in the sense that they can move these around, and it's hard for us to pinpoint them and destroy them. Just like with our Ohio class subs, okay? Our Ohio class subs are hidden underwater, and it's hard for the enemy to find them and destroy them. And so the ones that Russia has are known as the RS-28 Sarmat, and the missile that it shoots is known as the Satan II, okay? The Satan II is a code word that was created by NATO. NATO calls it the Satan II, and it's really called the RS-28 Sarmat. That's the truck, that's the TEL, and the Satan II is the missile that it fires. And the missile that it fires is a full-size ICBM that can hold multiple warheads or one giant warhead. It's a very advanced missile. It can do anything, okay? So they have a lot of these TELs, and that's a big component of their nuclear arsenal, okay? They're land-based, they're silos scattered throughout the Siberian taiga, which are going to be hard to find in a nuclear war and hard to destroy. And then they have their transporter erector launchers, which they can move anywhere inside of Russia. And Russia's a huge landmass, okay? And now you can see, most of Russia's arsenal is in this area here, okay? This area here, land and hybrid, is 70 to 80% of Russia's arsenal. And then you have a very small sea-based arsenal. They have less than 5 submarines that are able to launch ballistic missiles. And then they have what's known as the Status 6. And the Status 6 is a intercontinental torpedo that can hold 100 megaton warhead on it, and it can be detonated anywhere in the ocean, or it can move around in the ocean indefinitely. And so this is kind of like a sea-based leg here. The Status 6 kind of functions like a Ohio class sub, okay? But Russia has less than 5 subs with nukes on them, so it's not a very robust component, but they make up for it with their transporter erector launchers and their huge landmass that they can hide their silos. And they also make up for it with the Status 6. And the Status 6, I've done videos on it. It's a huge torpedo, but it's a torpedo that has a nuclear reactor on it, so it's powered by a nuclear reactor. And because it's powered by a nuclear reactor, it can stay underwater forever, basically, okay, at least 20 years. And this giant torpedo can constantly go around the ocean, and it can go very deep underwater because there's no crew on board. So it can go deeper than an Ohio class sub, because Ohio class subs have a human crew on board to run everything. So they can't go as deep, because if they go too deep, the pressure is going to kill the people inside. But because Status 6 is an unmanned underwater drone, it can go thousands of feet below the surface, which makes it very difficult to detect. And it also protects it from any kind of anti-submarine warfare activities like mining and stuff like that. So the Status 6 can go very deep underwater. It can avoid any kind of mines or anti-submarine countermeasures, okay, that normal subs have to worry about, because normal subs, even our Ohio class subs, they can't go as deep as the Status 6 can, okay? But our Ohio class subs can still go very, very deep. They can go at least 1,000 feet below the surface or even more. But the Status 6 can go over 3,000 feet. That's basically almost half a mile underwater, okay? And probably even deeper than that. And it has 100 megaton warhead on the tip of it. And that, remember the Tsar bomb? I talked about the Tsar bomb, how it was so powerful that it shattered glass 500 miles away from the detonation point, and that was a 50 megaton warhead. The Status 6 is rumored to have 100 megaton warhead on it, okay? With 100 megaton warhead, they could literally wipe out an entire U.S. state, okay, if this thing went off, all right? And that's called their doomsday weapon, okay? This is Russia's doomsday weapon. If we went into a nuclear war and Russia felt like they were losing, this is their weapon of last resort that they would use against one of our coastlines to obliterate our coastline. And most likely, they would target probably the Washington, D.C. and Norfolk Naval Base area and try to wipe that whole area out. And then finally, we have the air-based component, which they don't really have a true air-based triad air-based component. They just have the Tupolev 95 bombers, okay? And these are just not stealthy at all. They're just regular planes that they can load bombs onto and fly over to the U.S., but these would get shot down by fighter jets, okay, and anti-aircraft systems. They would pick them up right away and take them out, all right? But as you can see, Russia's system, or Russia's nuclear arsenal and their missiles are set up differently than the U.S. They have a much more robust land-based component because they're taking advantage of their giant landmass and their dense Siberian taiga that they can hide all their silos. And also they have the transporter erector launchers, which we don't really have any of. We don't have any transporter erector launchers. They have a lot of them. And so these two are like their main, this is where like 90% of their nuclear arsenal is. And then they have their subs. They don't have that many of those. And then they have their Status 6, which is a big threat. So that wraps up part 1, and stay tuned for part 2 which I'll be releasing in the coming days. And as we get deeper into the series, I'm going to get more into the specifics of how you can protect yourself and what to do if a bomb goes off near you, a nuclear weapon goes off. If you see a mushroom cloud in the horizon, what should you do? How do you take shelter? If you live in a big city, how do you protect yourself? Where can you go? What do you do? I'm going to talk about all these things. I'm going to talk about radiation protection, everything, okay? But we have to start with the basics first. We have to start with the bread before we get into the meat, okay? So right now we're at the bread stage, okay? We're eating the bread, and we haven't gotten to the meat yet of the sandwich, okay? But we're going to get to the meat of the sandwich soon, so be patient with me. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment down below. And if you want to support the channel, you can buy some of my t-shirts, my 3 Ps t-shirt, and you can do that by looking down below the video in the description box, and I have a link to my merchandise, and you can buy some shirts there, and you know, that'll support the channel and help me to continue to make these types of videos for you guys. But that's all I got for now. Stay tuned for part 2 in the coming days, and as always, take care, God bless, and don't forget the 3 Ps: prepare, practice, and persevere.